WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Bloomington, Indiana. Experience the holiday season by exploring unique downtown shops, experiencing local artisan markets, and enjoying one of the many seasonal performances. Plan a winter getaway and discover more holiday happenings at visitbloomington.com.
WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Gregory and Appel Insurance, dedicated to helping people and businesses navigate the complexities of risk management, employee benefits, and private client insurance. More at gregoryappel.com.
John Green is an award-winning writer and YouTuber. Green is best known as an author of young adult literature. His novels, including The Fault in Our Stars, Looking for Alaska, and Paper Towns, have sold over 50 million copies and inspired film adaptations. Green's latest book, Everything Is Tuberculosis, is a nonfiction work that examines how tuberculosis, a curable disease, continues to kill millions due to global inequality and public health failures. During my recent conversation with Green, we discussed Everything Is Tuberculosis, his work in public media, and his connection to Indianapolis. Let's join my conversation with John Green. John, thank you so much for taking time to be here today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Kyle.
We're going to talk about your new book, Everything Is Tuberculosis. But first, I wanted to focus a bit on your connection to Indianapolis. I think it's pretty well known that you moved here in 2007 with your wife, Sarah. She took a position as curator of contemporary art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. But your connection to Indianapolis is much deeper than that. From what I know, you were born here in 1977. Your parents grew up here, went to high school here, met here. Tell me a bit about your connection to Indianapolis. And when you moved here in 2007, I know you left when you were an infant, but did it feel like you were connecting with some bit of your family's history?
By then, I didn't have a lot of family in Indianapolis, but I still felt connected to the place. And when Sarah told me, we were going to move wherever she got a job. But when she told me we were moving to Indianapolis, I was like, that's great. And then I called my dad, and my dad was like, I worked so hard to get out of there. But he now lives in Indianapolis, so he's come all the way back around as well. I felt immediately like, not that I was home necessarily, because like you said, I moved away from Indianapolis when I was like 6 weeks old. So what do I remember of that? Nothing. But over the years, I've come to think of it as the only place that's ever really felt like home. I'm so fortunate to have that in my life. I think a lot of us don't ever feel like we're at home. And when I'm in Indianapolis, regardless of where I am in town, I always feel like I'm home.
When you were a kid growing up in Alabama, there were no family trips to Indianapolis to reconnect with?
Oh, there were some.
Lost relatives.
So we still had, back then, my grandparents were still living, and they lived around like 42nd Street. And we would go and visit with them. And I remember catching fireflies in the summertime at night with my grandfather. My grandmother died when I was quite young, but yeah, the first time I ever played a video game was in Indianapolis with my grandfather. He was a big tech guy, and so he had a Commodore 64, and I was just blown away. That was the most excited I've ever been in my life, playing Space Invaders.
Well, that's a good core memory to have of Indianapolis.
Yeah.
I know your father had deep roots in Indiana.
Yeah.
But I want to ask about one of your relatives on your mother's side. I believe your grandfather is named great-grandfather, Henry Goodrich, right?
Yeah.
He only lived in Indianapolis for about a decade, but he left a big influence here. I think he moved here in the 1960s to work for the Inland
Container
Company.
Yeah.
That was his day job, but he was very civically engaged. He served in major leadership roles in many prominent boards, including boards at St. Vincent's Hospital, the Children's Museum, the Economic Club of Indiana. His influence was so great that Marian University awarded him an honorary doctorate in the 1970s. And in 1976, the Indianapolis Star named him one of the 20 most influential people in Indianapolis, alongside Mayor Hudnut and people whose names are now on street signs and buildings, right? Tell me about your relationship with your grandfather, Henry, and how much interest or awareness do you have of the role he had shaping Indianapolis in the 70s?
Well, it's very kind of you to point all that out, and I really appreciate you doing that research and digging deep into my I call him Pawpaw, my Pawpaw's life. He was an extraordinary person and also an extraordinary grandfather. I was very fortunate to be at a good school when I was in high school, and and I wasn't a good student at all. I was a really poor student, actually, and my grandfather took me out to lunch one day, and he said, "I'll never forget it, or as long as I have a memory, I'll remember it." He said, "This is a privilege. You are incredibly fortunate to be able to go to high school. Lots of people don't get to go to high school. I had to struggle to get to high school, and then I had to struggle my way through college. And seeing you waste this opportunity is heartbreaking for me." And that was pretty much the day that things changed for me. I went home that day feeling very chastised and feeling pretty small, and thought to myself, maybe I need to have a different relationship with school and with life in general. And it's one of those rare conversations that actually changes your life. The other thing about my grandfather that I remember is that one time he told me, I don't buy you stuff. I'm not going to be somebody who buys you stuff. You're going to get $20 at Christmas, just like the other grandkids, but I will always buy you books. And he meant that. And I grew up in a house that was, not wealthy by many standards, but was rich in books. And I was just very grateful for that. So, yeah, he was a great civic leader, not just in Indianapolis, but also in Birmingham, where he spent most of his career, and really an extraordinary person.
You and your wife, Sarah, have had a big role as community leaders in some ways here in Indianapolis in the 21st century. Do you feel any sort of kinship with the role your grandfather had here?
Well, that's very generous of you to say. I would hope that we can contribute. Everybody wants to contribute to their community, whether that's by serving as the vice president of your homeowners association, as I once did, the hardest job I've ever had, or whether it's serving on boards or supporting organizations that are doing important work in the city. And so it's very important to us that we try to support that work where we see it.
One more question about your family, and I think this pertains to your grandfather Henry's brother, John Thomas Goodrich, who I believed you were named after, right?
Yeah.
John was a writer. In fact, he published a novel in 1933 titled Cotton Cavalier. This book has faded into obscurity, but when it was published, it was positively reviewed by the New York Times. It received national attention. It deals with the subject of lynching. It sounds like it was a very heavy book. It's hard to find the book today. I think John died when you were an infant, but did his legacy as a writer in any way kind of speak to you and kind of maybe give you a glimmer of hope that this is maybe an occupation you could aspire to?
He did. It is hard to find. My grandfather had a copy that he got printed from the Library of Congress, and I read it when I was about 20. And look, it's from the 30s. In a lot of ways, it doesn't hold up, but it is about important themes, both in terms of race, but also in terms of the Scopes monkey trial. And it's a really, I read it when I was 20, and it did. That's exactly the impact it had on me. I thought, well, this is not part of my family's legacy. Like, this is something that maybe I could do. And that's been something I carried with me. I did worry that, like him, I would only write one book. But then when I wrote a second book, I was like, all right, I'm going to be okay.
I'm Kyle Long, and you're listening to Cultural Manifesto. My guest is the author John Green. Prior to his rise as a best-selling novelist, Green wrote and recorded short essays for the Chicago public radio station WBEZ. Here's an example.
When I moved to Chicago, I got an apartment in Wicker Park. I picked Wicker Park because I wanted to live with the sort of people who prefer slam poetry to actual poetry, the sort of hipsters for whom vintage polyester is not so much a fashion choice as a lifestyle. But it turned out that Wicker Park already had a lot of rich people, and a Starbucks. I arrived in Wicker Park during the golden age of its gentrification, back when trendy girls in Weezer t-shirts still bothered to lament the influx of ambience chasers. Chicago's gentrification is a little like its weather. Everyone complains about it, but no one ever shuts up and moves to Georgia, where it rarely snows and the housing is cheaper.
Let's return to my conversation with John Green as we discuss his work in public media. One of the things I wanted to discuss with you today is President Trump's defunding of public media. But first, I wanted to learn a bit more about your history with public media. After graduating from college in the early 2000s, you moved to Chicago, where you began writing and recording essays that were broadcast on WBEZ public radio in Chicago. I think some of these were also broadcast nationally on All Things Considered.
Yeah.
This must have felt like a huge break in your early career when you were kind of struggling to get your career as a writer off the ground. Did it feel like that? And kind of what was your relationship with public media?
I mean, it was the break. It was the break that I got in my career, and I don't think that I would have been able to publish a novel without it. I don't think I would have had the confidence to write the novel without it. So I mean, public media and public radio especially has played a hugely influential role in my creative life, first as a consumer of it and then as a creator of it. When my friend Amy Cross Rosenthal first reached out to me about writing something for the radio, she had a little show within a show called Writer's Block Party. It was about 8 minutes long. And so she asked me if I had something 2 minutes long. And I said yes. And then that night I went home and wrote something 2 minutes long. And she put it on the radio. And it just felt amazing to be able to reach that many people. The intimacy of radio, you're in your car, you're on your lawnmower, you're wherever you are, but there's something very, very special about connecting with someone through their listening. There's a level of focus to it that I think is different to other forms of media. And so I just loved it from the very first time I got the chance to do it. And then being able to be on All Things Considered, I mean, that was one of the I've been fortunate to have a lot of wonderful moments in my career, but probably nothing will ever feel that good because nothing like that had ever happened to me before. And so it wasn't just that public radio helped support me financially when I was starting out as a writer, although it did in a small way. It was that it gave me the encouragement, the feeling that I could reach an audience and that the audience could respond generously to my work. And that has been hugely important in the career that came from that.
You were working at WBEZ at a very exciting time. I think during the years you were there, This American Life was becoming sort of a national phenomenon.
Yeah.
Did it feel like at any point that public media might be your future? Were you thinking at all about that, or was this just always kind of a side quest to your work as a writer?
Oh, I would have loved to work full-time for BEZ, and I would have loved to be closer to the This American Life people who I admired so much and still admire so much. I'm just a huge public radio fan in general. I have been since I was a little kid. And so it felt like, when you go to a museum, when you go to a fancy museum and you see your own artwork there, that's what it felt like to be on BEZ to me. It was just such a special thing. And I have to say, I feel that way today. Like, I still feel that way. I had the butterflies coming in here because I was thinking, oh man, I'm gonna be on public radio. I'm gonna sit in front of that microphone.
Yeah. John, as I'm sure you know, the Trump administration has cut all federal funding for public media. This has effectively killed the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has survived for over 50 years with bipartisan support.
Right.
It was bipartisan support that kept public media alive since its inception. Here in Indiana, our governor, Mike Braun, has followed Trump's lead and cut all state funding for public media. This has been devastating for public media, especially stations that serve rural communities. There's fears that this may create news deserts in communities around the United States where they won't have important information about local politics, school board elections, local health news, right? Public health news. How does all this strike you? What are your concerns about the defunding of public media?
It's heartbreaking for me to see public media defunded. And as you said, this has been a bipartisan issue for a very long time because there's been an understanding that Americans need access to reliable information. And I would say that Americans need access to reliable information now more than ever. And so the idea that some people are going to be deprived of that is really devastating. And I think it's bad news for the social order. I think it's bad news for the country. And it's hard to watch. At the same time, I've been very heartened to see so many people step up and support their public radio and public television stations. And I've been very encouraged to see the fact that, public media is finding a way in a world where it is tragically less public and more needs to be supported by the public. And so that's my hope. But it's a very difficult moment. It's a heartbreaking moment. I hope this proves temporary, but it's, you know, putting aside the fact that we all need access to news, we also need access to cultural information. We also need shows like Cultural Manifesto. We need, 23-year-old writers telling jokes in their essays and writing about their, great uncle who was a novelist. And we need that stuff. We benefit as a culture, as a community, as a state. We benefit from that. And so depriving the world of that, of the kind of high quality information that may not lend itself to the highest level of profit, but does lend itself to the highest level of reliability and trustworthiness, depriving people of that is really a shame.
Yeah, you're around the same age as me. I grew up with Mr. Rogers, Sesame Street, Reading Rainbow. So much of what public media does is not controversial. It's in the interest of the public good. Why do you think it's become such a target for the Trump administration? In an interview earlier this year, President Trump suggested that NPR was somehow affiliated with Antifa.
Yeah. Well,
not
I
true.
think it's not true, just to be clear. I think it's partly that reliable information, trustworthy information is a problem for people who want to have total control over narratives. And that's not exclusive to any political party, but if you want to have a total control over the narrative, then the truth may be a problem for you at times. And I think that's part of what we're seeing. But I also think we're seeing a response to a sort of wave of, I don't know how to describe it other than anti-intellectualism, a wave of we shouldn't trust experts on what they're experts in. We shouldn't believe in the idea of expertise. We shouldn't believe in the idea of reliable information that we can all agree upon. I think all of that is kind of coming together to create this huge cultural divide that is really just devastating to me to watch play out because, like you said, the gift of Mr. Rogers or the gift in my adulthood of a show like Fresh Air or the gift, if you're a kid in Indianapolis who loves music and loves art, Cultural Manifesto is the coolest thing in town. Like it's the coolest thing happening in the city. And we need that. We need to support those young people. We need to try to keep them in Indianapolis, frankly. And so it's really hard for me to watch public media struggle when the gifts it gives are so obvious and important.
John, I do want to talk about your latest project, Everything Is Tuberculosis, a book that was published earlier this year. Prior to reading this book, if someone had told me a book about tuberculosis would be so entertaining and engaging, I would have found that very hard to believe. But it's really an engrossing book, and I loved it. It's an incredible work.
Thank you.
Yeah, congratulations on this book. The book provides a historical overview of tuberculosis, as well as personal narratives about your friendship with a young man named Henry in Sierra Leone who's fighting against tuberculosis. This book is very different from some of the past work you've done as a novelist. How did you come to write a book about tuberculosis, if you could kind of put that in a nutshell?
Yeah, well, I think it started out for me with meeting Henry, this kid in Sierra Leone who was struggling with multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. And I came home from that trip just astonished to learn that TB is still the deadliest infectious disease in the world, that it's been curable since the 1950s, but it still kills over 1 million people a year. Like, what does that say about us as a species? What does that say about our priorities? To go back to conversations about public media, what does it say about my own information landscape that I had no idea that tuberculosis was still a thing, when I was 40 years old? I didn't know that. I thought tuberculosis was like a disease of 19th century poets. And so I wanted to understand the disease. So I started out writing to try to understand, because writing is my way of thinking. And then slowly over years, I realized that I might be actually writing a book.
In the book, you mentioned tuberculosis being a disease of 19th century poets. In the book, you trace the impact of tuberculosis on history and popular culture. You trace the invention of the cowboy hat to tuberculosis. Yeah. You write about the effect of tuberculosis on writers like Keats and George Orwell. This must have taken years to research all these stories and go down all these rabbit holes. Tell me about the process of putting this together. Was this like years in the making as you researched this subject?
It was years in the making. My wife would say that I only read about tuberculosis for about 4 years, and that's probably true. I tried to read like at least one novel a year, but it was often a novel about tuberculosis. I just became obsessed with the disease and trying to understand it, trying to understand its role in history. I mean, this is the deadliest disease we've ever faced. It killed 1 billion people in the last 200 years. It probably is responsible for 1 in 4 deaths in the United States in the 19th century. My own great uncle, Stokes Goodrich, Henry Goodrich's brother, died of tuberculosis when he was 29. And so it's just a disease that everywhere I looked, I kept finding it. And so, yeah, it did take a lot of research, but it didn't necessarily feel like research. I was just reading about tuberculosis because that's what I wanted to read about.
And John, the book shines a light on the inequities in our global health system. As you mentioned, tuberculosis kills over 1 million people a year, but this is a treatable disease.
Yeah.
That number could be 0 in a fair and just world. Since you published this book in March, the global public health system was dealt a major blow when the Trump administration cut funding for USAID. Mm-hmm. Experts have said this will lead to a large increase in the number of tuberculosis cases and in deaths caused by tuberculosis.
Yeah.
It's of course tragic, and it must be especially frustrating for you as you're out on this campaign to educate people about how investing in public health can improve outcomes for people around the world. Yeah, tell me your thoughts on that.
In the same way that I never imagined a world without the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I never imagined a world without USAID. You know, when I was writing the book, it never crossed my mind once that we could live in a world where, you know, frankly, I thought I could kind of be a little critical of USAID because there are issues with the way that they distributed resources, I think, and they didn't fully kind of decolonize after the Cold War in thinking about how best to distribute health aid. That said, USAID has saved a huge number of lives, and the idea of being in a world without it was unfathomable to me. And indeed, on some level, is still quite scary to me because, you know, it's not like tuberculosis knows about borders. It's not like tuberculosis thinks about the overall amount of healthcare funding there is. It's just that like tuberculosis numbers go up when we don't address the TB crisis and go down when we do. And unfortunately, this means that, as you said, it's going to probably go up. Maybe not this year, but in the next few years as we start to really feel the pinch of a diminished level of aid. Now, it's not just the United States. The UK, the EU have also pulled back funding in important ways. But the United States is overwhelmingly the epicenter of this issue because, you know, for what was about 1/2 of 1 cent of our tax dollar, we were saving, you know, maybe millions of lives every year. Not just from TB, but from malaria, from HIV. You know, George W. Bush's incredible program, PEPFAR, has saved tens of millions of lives. And so the idea that the global health system is just going to have to suddenly deal with the shock of not having that funding is really hard for me to get my head around. And I think for a lot of people, you know, they're trying to figure out how to do this, how to handle this, how to live in this new world. But it's really heartbreaking to me that this was what was, you know, kind of targeted by Doge, targeted by Elon Musk. And, you know, this was something that the United States did that I think we could be really proud of as a country. And the same can be said for public media.
There's been a lot of misinformation about USAID spread by Doge. As you were out in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in these hospitals that are treating tuberculosis patients, did you see kind of the effect that USAID has on global health?
Yeah, and not just in Sierra Leone. I've seen it in Ethiopia. I've seen it in the Philippines. I've seen it all over the world. You know, this is an organization, like I said, that has saved literally millions of lives. That's not to say that it's above critique. It's not to say that it behaved perfectly, but it was very efficient. And the way that it was portrayed as an organization of fraud and waste that spent all of its money on, you know, anti-TB parties or whatever is just ludicrous. Like, I'll give you one example. So they say that aid is still flowing in the sense that life-saving commodities are still moving, which is true to some extent. And I want to be grateful for that, because without it, there would be a true catastrophe. But hundreds of thousands of people saw their treatment interrupted. And when your treatment is interrupted for TB, you're very likely to develop drug resistance. And then your TB becomes very difficult to cure, much more expensive to treat, still possible to cure, but much more expensive and time-consuming to cure. And that's something that happened because of a choice that we made. And in many cases, we have drugs sitting in warehouses that are waiting for someone to pick them up in trucks, but there's no money for the trucks. There's only money for the drugs. That's not government efficiency. That's the height of government inefficiency.
John, as we end 2025 and people look ahead to 2026 in the future, I'm curious for your thoughts on the direction we're going as a country. We've been talking about the defunding of public health, the defunding of public media. These issues exist in this very harsh political climate in the United States right now. Any thoughts about where we're headed as a country as we move into 2026?
I'm worried, but I refuse to give in to despair. I mean, the problem with despair is that it's like a replicating virus. All it makes is more of itself. And so I don't want to be there. I don't want to be in a place where I feel hopeless. I've got to find a way to, kind of, what did Mr. Rogers say? Look for the helpers. I've got to find a way to do that. And for me, that's looking toward people who are continuing the fight against diseases of injustice like TB. It's looking toward people who are continuing to find ways to make great stuff like WFYI. It's looking to organizations locally and nationally that are finding ways to work with our immigrant communities and support them, like Exodus Refugee. And, that's where my hope is.
Thank you for being here today, John. Any final thoughts you want to share with our audience here in Indiana?
No, just thanks for being here. Thanks for staying in Indianapolis. I hope you love it like I do.
Thank you so much for your time today, John. I sincerely appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Kyle.
Thank you. We've been listening to my recent conversation with author John Green. His latest book, Everything Is Tuberculosis, is out now.
WFYI podcasts are brought to you by Gregory and Appel Insurance, dedicated to helping people and businesses navigate the complexities of risk management, employee benefits, and private client insurance. More at gregoryappel.com.